50,000 soldiers, 70,000 enemies, open ground with nowhere to hide. Every military mind in the ancient world knew how this would end. The smaller army crushed beneath Roman discipline and overwhelming numbers. It didn't. This wasn't just about survival on a battlefield. This was the day tactical genius redefined what armies thought possible. What happened on that dusty plain involved a center deliberately designed to collapse, wings that moved like closing jaws, and a trap so perfect that 70,000 men marched willingly into their own annihilation. By sunset, the largest army Rome had ever assembled would cease to exist, not scattered, not routed, but methodically destroyed in the most complete battlefield victory in military history. To understand how a single afternoon erased a generation of Roman soldiers, you have to picture the summer of 216 BC, a world where Rome had never lost a war it truly committed to winning, a republic that believed its legions were unstoppable, not through arrogance, but through 2 centuries of bloody proof. And marching through southern Italy, moving closer each day, was the one man who had shattered that certainty, Hannibal Barca. For 2 years, he had done the impossible, crossed the Alps with elephants, ambushed armies in narrow valleys, won battles he should have lost. But victories in mountain passes and lakeside ambushes were one thing. This was different. Rome had decided to end the war with a single, overwhelming blow. They raised an army so massive it defied precedent. 8 full legions, reinforced with auxiliary troops from across Italy. 70,000 men, all converging on one objective: find Hannibal and crush him through sheer unstoppable mass. The Senate strategy was brutally simple. No more clever tactics, no more splitting forces. Just raw numerical superiority applied until the Carthaginian army broke. They appointed 2 consuls to share command, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one aggressive and hungry for glory, the other cautious, aware that Hannibal had won every battle by turning Roman strengths into traps. The tension between them hung over the army like a gathering storm. By late July, the 2 armies moved toward collision near a small town called Cannae in the heel of Italy. The land here sprawled flat and featureless, no forest to hide ambushes, no hills to grant advantage, just open plains baking under Mediterranean sun. Perfect ground for the Roman way of war. Dense formations, grinding forward, relying on discipline and depth to overwhelm anything in their path. Terrible ground for Hannibal, who had always used the rain as a weapon, or so Rome believed. This was far more than a military confrontation between 2 armies vying for control of Italy. This was Rome's existence hanging in the balance. 2 years of defeats had shaken the Republic's confidence, but not broken it. Hannibal had won battles, yes, but he hadn't taken Rome itself. The city's walls still stood. Its allies, though nervous, remained mostly loyal. This army represented Rome's answer, proof that numerical superiority, properly applied, could defeat even genius. If this army fell, everything changed. The largest force Rome had ever assembled destroyed, allies would abandon the Republic overnight. Cities would open their gates to Hannibal. The road to Rome itself would lie undefended. Every soldier marching toward Cannae understood. This wasn't just another battle in a long war. This was the moment that determined whether Rome continued as a power or collapsed into memory. For Hannibal, the stakes cut equally deep. His army, brilliant and battle-hardened, was still trapped in hostile territory. Every victory brought tactical success, but no strategic resolution. He needed something absolute, a blow so devastating that Rome's would have fight shattered completely. Anything less, and he would remain a brilliant general slowly bleeding to death in enemy lands, winning battles while losing the war. On the plains outside Cannae, 2 vastly different visions of warfare prepared to collide with the fate of the Mediterranean world hanging in the balance. The Roman camp sprawled across the landscape like a city transplanted to the field. 70,000 men required organization on a scale that dwarfed anything Hannibal could match. Tents stretched in perfect rows. Supply wagons formed their own district. The sound of it, hammers on stakes, officers shouting orders, the constant hum of an army that could barely comprehend its own size, carried for miles. From Hannibal's position across the Aufidus River, His scouts brought reports that should have filled his commanders with dread. The numbers alone seemed impossible to overcome. Roman heavy infantry, legionaries armored in mail, carrying the gladius and scutum, formed the core. 40,000 of them, arranged in maniples that could adapt to any battlefield situation. Their depth was extraordinary. Where most armies formed 8 ranks deep, the Romans at Cannae stood 16 deep in places, a human battering ram, designed to push through anything. Supporting them, 30,000 allied infantry from across Italy, Latin tribes, Samnites, others who had learned that resisting Rome brought only ruin, and cavalry, nearly 6,000 horsemen, split between Roman equites and allied riders. Not the strongest cavalry force, perhaps, but backed by such overwhelming infantry. They didn't need to be. Their job was simple: hold the flanks while the center did its brutal work. Command alternated daily between the two consuls. On the morning of August 2nd, Varro held authority. The aggressive one, the one who believed that Rome's patience with clever maneuvering had run its course. Time to end this with overwhelming force applied directly. Against this, Hannibal commanded roughly 50,000 soldiers. But what soldiers they were! His cavalry, 10,000 strong, represented the finest horsemen in the Mediterranean world. Numidian light cavalry, so skilled they could wheel and strike and vanish like desert wind. Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry, bred for shock charges that could shatter formations. In cavalry, Hannibal held clear superiority. But cavalry alone couldn't win against 70,000 infantry. His infantry came from a dozen different peoples. Spanish swordsmen in their distinctive white tunics with purple trim. Gallic warriors massive and fierce, fighting half-naked with long slashing swords. African veterans in captured Roman armor. The core of his army, disciplined, experienced, utterly reliable. And at the center, a mix of Iberians and Gauls, brave but less armored, less trained than the African troops or the Romans they would face. Hannibal had one advantage no one could quantify. He knew his enemy. He understood Roman tactical doctrine better than most Roman generals. He had studied how they fought, how they thought, what they believed about themselves. And on the night before battle, he began arranging his army into a formation that would use every Roman strength against them. Dawn broke clear and hot on August 2nd, 216 BC. The kind of heat that makes armor burn to touch, that turns throats dust dry within hours. Both armies moved into position slowly, the ritual deployment taking most of the morning. This was not a surprise encounter or a hasty clash. This was war conducted with full knowledge, two massive forces arranging themselves for mutual annihilation. The Roman formation took shape exactly as doctrine demanded. The heavy infantry formed the center, maniples arranged in checkerboard pattern, allowing flexibility and depth. 16 ranks deep, an enormous concentration of force designed to smash through whatever stood opposite. On the right wing, Roman cavalry under Paulus, the cautious consul who had argued against fighting today. On the left, allied cavalry commanded by subordinate officers. Behind the front lines, reserves waited in neat formation, ready to feed forward as the grinding work progressed. Varro, commanding from horseback, looked across the plain at Hannibal's deployment and saw what he wanted to see: an army trapped with its back to the river, formed in a line barely longer than Rome's, with a center that looked thin, vulnerable, exactly the kind of target Roman tactics were designed to destroy. Hannibal's formation, from a distance, appeared conventional enough. Cavalry on both wings, heavy cavalry under his brother Hasdrubal on the left, Numidian light cavalry on the right. And in the center, infantry formed a line that stretched to match Rome's frontage. But the shape of that line was strange. Instead of standing straight, the center bowed outward, a gentle convex curve, with the Gallic and Spanish infantry pushed forward ahead of the line, almost as if presenting themselves as a target. Behind them, pulled back slightly, stood the African veterans in two dense blocks flanking the curved center. Their position looked defensive, almost passive, as if Hannibal expected his center to be pushed back and needed reserves to catch the retreat. From the Roman perspective, the formation appeared amateurish. Why push your weakest troops forward? Why create a bulge that invited being hit from three sides? It looked like desperation, like Hannibal trying to maximize his frontage by thinning his line. It was none of those things. Around midday, after hours of positioning and counterpositioning, the trumpet sounded. The Roman line began its advance. Not rushing. Roman discipline didn't permit wild charges, but moving forward in controlled steps, maintaining formation, the front ranks holding shields high while the ranks behind pressed forward with the weight of thousands. The ground between the armies shrank. 400 yards, 300, 200. The sound built like approaching thunder, not from shouting, but from the rhythmic tramp of 70,000 feet moving as one organism, the rattle of equipment, the creak of leather and metal. When the lines met, it began not with a crash, but with a grinding, splintering shock that rippled across the entire front. Shields slammed into shields. Swords probed for gaps. Men in the front rank pushed and stabbed while those behind drove forward with their shoulders, adding their weight to the human press. The Gauls and Spaniards in Hannibal's center fought with desperate courage. They held the initial impact, pushed back, found footing, and held again. The line bent but didn't break. For minutes that stretched into an eternity, the bulge in Hannibal's center held firm against the Roman weight. Then, gradually, inevitably, it began to give way. The Roman front ranks, feeling the center buckle, pressed harder. This was exactly what their training prepared them for, the moment when enemy resistance started to crack. Officers shouted encouragement. The maniples in the second line fed forward, adding fresh soldiers to the killing edge. Slowly, step by bloody step, the Roman center pushed the Gallic and Spanish infantry backward. Hannibal's convex line began to flatten. Then it started curving inward. The Gauls and Spaniards, fighting desperately, gave ground and controlled retreat. Not breaking, not fleeing, but falling back under pressure they couldn't match. From Varro's position, this looked like victory was approaching. The enemy's center was collapsing. His legionaries were doing what Roman legionaries always did, grinding forward, inevitable as a millstone. The battle was unfolding exactly according to every lesson Rome had learned across 2 centuries of warfare. Apply overwhelming force to the center. Break through. Pursue the broken enemy. Win. So the Roman center kept pressing. More maniples fed into the grinder. The formation's depth compressed as men pushed forward into the space the retreating enemy created. The neat checkerboard pattern began to lose shape as units crowded together, drawn forward by the momentum of apparent victory. No one in the Roman ranks noticed that as their center pushed deeper, their frontage was narrowing. The formation, so wide at the start, was funneling inward, pulled forward by the bulge that kept retreating but never quite breaking. The legionaries were so focused on the enemy directly ahead, the Gauls falling back step by step, that they didn't look to their flanks. They didn't see the African veterans standing motionless on either side. For 20 minutes, maybe 30, the center ground on. The Romans advanced perhaps 200 yards, the Carthaginian center bending like a bow under impossible strain. The Gauls and Spaniards were being annihilated, men falling by the dozen, formations thinning, exhaustion turning limbs to lead. But they held cohesion. They kept falling back in formation. And that retreat, paradoxically, was the most important maneuver of the battle, because while the Roman center pushed forward, their flanks became exposed in a way their commanders didn't immediately recognize. The dense Roman formation now formed a bulge of its own, projecting forward and narrowed, with their sides no longer protected by the natural extension of their line. On Hannibal's left wing, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry had already shattered the Roman cavalry facing them. The Roman horsemen, competent but not exceptional, broke under the charge of Spanish and Gallic riders who lived for exactly this kind of brutal shock combat. Hasdrubal didn't pursue the fleeing cavalry into the distance. Instead, with iron discipline, he wheeled his squadrons and rode behind the entire Roman army to strike the allied cavalry on the opposite flank. The allied horsemen, already struggling against the Numidians, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 cavalry forces. They broke, scattered. Within minutes, Hannibal's cavalry controlled the entire battlefield's flanks and rear, but they still held back from striking the Roman infantry. Not yet. The moment approached like the slow close of massive doors. The Roman center, now compressed into a dense mass, pushed the Carthaginian center back until Hannibal's line had transformed from convex to concave, a deep inward curve, almost a U-shape, with the Romans packed at the bottom of that like grain funneled into a sack. Then Hannibal gave the signal his African veterans had been waiting for. The 2 blocks of African heavy infantry, positioned on either side of the collapsing center, wheeled inward 90 degrees and charged into the exposed Roman flanks. The legionaries, focused entirely on the enemy ahead of them, barely comprehended what was happening. Suddenly men were falling not from the front, but from the side. African veterans, wearing captured Roman armor, moving with the disciplined professional soldiers, crashed into the compressed Roman formations from both flanks simultaneously. A Roman legion was designed to fight forward. Its strength came from depth, from the ability to cycle fresh men to the front, from the mutual support of the checkerboard formation. But that formation had already compressed and distorted during the forward push. And now, attacked from 3 sides at once, the fundamental assumptions of Roman tactical doctrine collapsed. Men, in the middle of the formation, couldn't fight, couldn't even raise their weapons. The crush became so dense that soldiers suffocated standing up, pinned upright by the bodies pressed against them. Those on the edges tried to turn to face the flanking attacks, found no room to maneuver. The formation that had been Rome's greatest strength, its depth and density, became a death trap, and then Hannibal's cavalry struck from behind. Hasdrubal's horsemen, having swept both Roman flanks in the field, charged into the rear of the trapped infantry. The encirclement was sealed completely. 70,000 Roman soldiers now stood compressed into a shrinking space, surrounded on all sides, with nowhere to run and no space to fight effectively. What followed was not a battle. It was systematic destruction. The killing lasted for hours, not because the Romans resisted effectively. They couldn't, trapped as they were, but because slaughtering that many men takes time even when they're helpless. Hannibal's forces pressed inward from every direction, the circle tightening like a noose, leaving corpses in layers so thick that soldiers climbed on mounds of the dead to reach the living. Some legionaries tried to break out. Small groups would form a wedge and charge desperately at one section of the encirclement. A few made it through, scattered survivors who would stumble into Roman territory days later with stories no one wanted to believe. Most died in the attempt, cut down by cavalry or dragged down by African infantry. Others, exhausted and surrounded, threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Some received it and were taken prisoner. 10,000 Romans would survive as captives, but mercy was scarce. The Gallic and Spanish warriors, who had absorbed the Roman center's assault for half an hour, now took brutal revenge on the men who had been killing them minutes before. Consul Paulus, the cautious one who had argued against fighting, died in the press. Accounts later recorded that he refused to flee even when offered a horse, choosing instead to stand with his men in their final moments. 80 Roman senators and magistrates fell alongside him, Rome's leadership bleeding out in the dust. Varro, the aggressive consul whose confidence had pushed for this battle, managed to escape with a small group of cavalry. He would carry news of the disaster back to Rome, where his rival, alive, while 50,000 of his men lay dead, would mark him forever as the man who survived Rome's greatest defeat. By sunset, the plain at Cannae had transformed into a landscape of the dead. Bodies carpeted the earth so completely that the ground itself disappeared beneath them. 70,000 men had marched confidently across this field that morning. Fewer than 10,000 would ever see Rome again. Hannibal's casualties numbered perhaps 6,000, terrible losses for his army, concentrated among the Gauls and Spanish who had held the center. But compared to what he had inflicted, it was nothing. He had annihilated the largest army Rome had ever assembled, not by defeating it in open combat, but by making its own strength the mechanism of its destruction. In the days after Cannae, news of the disaster spread across Italy like wildfire. Cities that had remained loyal to Rome suddenly reconsidered. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal. Other cities followed. For the first time in the war, Rome faced a real possibility of collapse. But Rome did not collapse. The Senate refused to negotiate. They forbade public mourning. Grief was private, but the city would show no weakness. They raised new legions from old men and young boys barely old enough to hold a sword. They armed slaves and promised them freedom if they fought. The Republic, wounded almost to death, simply refused to die. Hannibal, despite his tactical masterpiece, could not capitalize fully on the victory. He lacked siege equipment to assault Rome's walls. His Carthaginian government, skeptical of his strategy, sent minimal reinforcements. And Rome, proving more resilient than anyone imagined, adapted. They stopped fighting Hannibal in open battle. Instead, they harassed the supply lines, retook rebellious cities one by one, and slowly, over years, bled his army down. Cannae became the battle that changed everything and nothing. It destroyed an army but not a state. It proved tactical genius could defeat vastly superior numbers, but also that genius alone couldn't win a war if the defeated refused to accept defeat. For 2,000 years, military academies have studied Cannae obsessively. Generals from Scipio to Napoleon to Eisenhower analyzed the double envelopment, the trap built from apparent weakness, the way Hannibal used the enemy's own momentum against them. The battle became the gold standard of tactical perfection, the moment when every element of battlefield command aligned into something approaching art. But the lesson of Cannae goes deeper than tactics. It's a study in how weakness can be transformed into strength when understood clearly enough. Hannibal's center was genuinely weaker than Rome's. He didn't pretend otherwise. He simply made that weakness serve his purpose. Bait for a trap that required the enemy to believe they were winning right up until the moment they realized they were dying. The 70,000 Romans who marched into that trap weren't fools. They were well-trained soldiers following sound tactical doctrine, executing a plan that had worked countless times before. But they fought the battle Hannibal designed for them, and that made all the difference. On that dusty plain outside Cannae, surrounded by the corpses of an army that believed itself invincible, Hannibal proved something that military commanders have spent 2 millennia trying to replicate: that understanding your enemy completely, using every element of the battlefield precisely, and having the iron courage to turn your own weakness into a lure. These things combined can overcome almost any numerical disadvantage. The sun set on Cannae on August 2nd, 216 BC, illuminating a field where Rome's pride lay shattered and a Carthaginian general stood victorious in the most perfect tactical achievement in the history of warfare. The bodies would remain there for months. Too many to bury, a monument to what happens when genius meets opportunity and refuses to accept the limits of what seems possible.